Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to do a deep dive on, well, it's a fascinating topic, I think.
Oh, yeah.
It's about how friendships can turn romantic, like making that shift.
Oh, that is an interesting
Yeah,
one.
we're going to be looking at your lecture about how to navigate that whole process.
Oh, great. I'm excited to see what you pulled from it.
I think our listeners are really going to connect with this one. Maybe some of them are even thinking about taking that leap with a friend,
It's a pretty common situation, that's for sure.
for sure. But even if they aren't in that situation, the dynamics of how friendships can shift like that, how they can
Mhm.
change, oh, it's just plain interesting.
Absolutely. And in the lecture, I really try to get into the psychology behind all of it. Like, all those neurochemicals that are swirling around when we feel those feelings and how important vulnerability is.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting
Yeah.
because it's not like just asking a friend to hang out.
Yeah.
It's so much more than that.
Right. It's a completely different way of seeing someone, interacting with them, someone you already care about, too.
Exactly. And one of the first things you mentioned in the lecture was how different neurotransmitters are involved in both friendship and romantic attraction.
Yeah. But the way they work is very different. Like serotonin and oxytocin, those are both important for bonding and comfort, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
They're super dominant in friendships. But when romantic feelings come into play, dopamine takes over.
Dopamine, that's the pleasure and reward chemical, isn't it?
It is, and it makes things so much more complex. We talk about the friend zone
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah. You hear that all the time.
But really, what it means is there's already a strong neurochemical connection there, just not the romantic kind.
So to get out to you, the friend zone, do you have to, shift those chemicals somehow?
It's not really about shifting them so much as understanding how they work and how they change how we act. Actually, the lecture talks about dopamine as like a double-edged sword.
A double-edged sword. How so?
Well, it creates all that excitement, that feeling of falling in love. But at the same time, it can make you ignore some things, like those little red flags.
Have you ever felt that? Like a crazy rush for someone, but then later you're like, wait a minute.
Oh, totally. Happens to everyone, I think. Like that saying, love is blind, right? You get so caught up in the dopamine that you miss things, even your gut feelings.
Oh, I've been there.
Hmm.
So how do you stay grounded, especially when things are feeling so intense?
The first step is just knowing about the dopamine effect. Once you realize how powerful it can be, you can be a little more objective.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another thing is having friends you can trust. They can see things from the outside.
They can give you a reality check when you need it.
Exactly. Especially in those early stages when things are so exciting and maybe you're not thinking as clearly as you normally would, because the stakes can be pretty high.
That's true. Especially if you're thinking about risking a really good friendship.
That's exactly what the lecture calls it. A high-stakes emotional endeavor. And it really is, It's not just about maybe losing someone you're romantically interested in. You could lose a really important friend.
That fear of ruining the friendship, I think that's a big one for people. Why is it so scary?
Well, our brains are wired to keep us safe.
Safe and secure.
Yeah, and friendships, they provide that feeling. They're stable, we belong. So when you start thinking about changing that, especially for something as unpredictable as romance,
It's like shaking things up too much.
right, it can trigger those primal fears, the
Mm.
fear of loss, of instability.
Like an evolutionary thing.
It could be. But the thing is, sometimes those risks lead to amazing things. And the lecture talks about that too.
That's true. You never know what could happen unless you take a chance, right?
Exactly. But to make that shift from friendship to romance, one of the most important things, according to the lecture, is something called mutual vulnerability.
Mutual vulnerability.
Yeah, both people have to be open, willing to share their feelings, and be okay with the idea that the other person might reject them.
I can see why that would be scary.
It is. But there was this study from the University of California. It found that vulnerability was one of the biggest things that predicted whether or not people could successfully move from friendship to romance.
Really? So even though it feels safer to hold back, being open and honest actually increases your chances.
That's what they found. Couples who were vulnerable with each other early on, they built more trust, more intimacy, and their relationships lasted longer and were more satisfying.
Wow. So taking that leap of faith and being genuine can actually help things work out.
According to that study, it does. It's like a sign of strength, not weakness.
And I bet those early conversations, even if things don't work out romantically, they can still strengthen the friendship.
Oh, absolutely. It's like you're saying, I trust you enough to be this honest with you.
Right. and that builds a deeper connection no matter what.
For sure. So we've got the brain science, the importance of vulnerability. Now, how does this all actually play out in the real world?
The dance of flirting and signals, right? That's a whole different way of communicating.
Oh yeah, things get interesting here. Because flirting, when it's between friends, it's more than just jokes or trying to impress each other.
What is it then?
It's like testing the waters, seeing if there's something more there, gauging if the other person feels it too.
You're speaking a different language almost? Those looks, inside jokes that suddenly mean something new. Even a touch that might have been completely friendly before.
Yeah, everything feels different, like it's charged with this new kind of energy. Yeah. It's like those little cues, they suddenly become super important. A touch on the arm, a compliment that you might not have thought twice about before, suddenly they mean something different.
It's like the volume gets turned up on everything.
Exactly. But this is where things can get tricky. In the lecture, I talk about this phase as being particularly awkward.
The awkward phase? Oh, I think everyone who's tried to make this shift from friendship to romance knows exactly what you're talking about. It's like you overthink every little thing.
Totally. You're like, did I come on too strong? Was that too subtle? Do they even get it? It's a minefield.
The minefield. And this is where good communication is key, right?
Yeah. But it's not just about saying, hey, I like you out of the blue.
So it's more complicated than that.
It is. It's about recognizing that the whole dynamic has shifted. The expectations are different now. You have to be mindful of that.
Okay, so you have to be a little more intentional about how you communicate. But what does that actually look like?
Well, the lecture talks about using I statements when you're setting boundaries.
I statements.
Yeah, so that the other person doesn't feel attacked. Like instead of saying, you're texting me way too much, you could say, I love hearing from you, but I also need some time to myself sometimes.
Okay, so you're being honest, but also respectful.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. And this needs to be an ongoing conversation, too. What works today might feel different in a few weeks.
Because things are constantly evolving.
Right. So you got to keep checking in, be honest about your feelings, and adjust those expectations as you go.
This makes me think about those situations where one person is thinking long-term relationship and the other person's more like, let's just see where things go.
Oh, yeah. And if you don't talk about that stuff, it can blow up in your face. The lecture says avoiding these conversations is a huge mistake.
It's like ignoring a giant elephant in the room.
It is. It's not just about hurt feelings either. When you have these mismatched expectations, it throws the whole thing off balance. Someone ends up feeling resentful, and that can ruin the friendship.
So having that define the relationship talk is important, even if it's awkward.
It is. And you know what? The more uncomfortable you feel about those conversations, the more important that friendship probably is to you. If you're willing to push through that awkwardness, it means you care a lot about the relationship, whether it becomes romantic or not.
That's a really good point. It's a measure of how much you value that connection.
Exactly. And it ties back into that vulnerability thing we were talking about earlier.
Being willing to be uncomfortable, to take a risk for something more. But what about when things don't work out? The lecture talks about the emotional fallout when romance doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's the tough part. I've seen friendships completely fall apart because of this. It's like all that awkwardness gets magnified times 10 when there's heartbreak involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that? How do you navigate that mess?
The lecture talks about emotional maturity, which is way easier said than done when you're hurting, right?
Yeah.
The first step is acknowledging the loss.
You mean the loss of the potential romance?
Yeah. Yeah. And the loss of how things were in the friendship, too. Things have changed, and that's sad. It's okay to grieve that. You don't have to blame yourself or the other person.
Yeah, I think people forget that you're allowed to grieve, even if it wasn't a full-blown relationship. You had these hopes, these ideas about what it could be, and now that's gone.
Exactly. And once you've let yourself feel those feelings, then you can have a conversation about how to move forward. Maybe you need space for a while. Or maybe you work on rebuilding the friendship.
It sounds like there's no easy answer. It depends on the situation.
For sure. But the big takeaway is the friendship has changed, and you have to honor that. But still be respectful and caring towards each other.
And sometimes going through something hard like this can actually make the friendship stronger in the long run.
Right. The lecture talks about that too. It's like you've been through this intense experience together. If you can come out on the other side with empathy, it can deepen the bond you already had.
So all this talk about challenges and potential heartbreak, it makes me wonder, can friendship and romance really coexist? The lecture brings up this big question, and I'm curious what your thoughts are.
It's a tough one. And the lecture doesn't try to give a simple answer. Some people believe that once you cross that line, you can never go back, even if the romance doesn't work out.
The dynamic is just different.
Yeah, it's like you've changed the recipe. Even if you take that ingredient back out, it's not the same dish anymore. And for some people, that's just too big of a risk. They'd rather keep the friendship as it is.
They don't want to mess with a good thing.
Right. But the lecturer also says that friendship can be the absolute best foundation for romance. That shared history, knowing each other's quirks, all that builds a really strong bond.
And so many couples started out as friends, right? You hear that all the time.
All the time, they had that foundation of respect and affection already in place.
It's like they have a head start. They've already weathered some storms together.
I like that. They're already a team. And the lecture says this can create a sense of security that helps the relationship grow.
So is the lecture saying one approach is better than the other?
Not really. It comes down to the people, their communication and how much they're willing to put into it.
So instead of asking, can it work?
Yeah.
Maybe we should be asking, can this friendship at this time with these two people work?
It's a case-by-case thing, which can be frustrating because we want clear answers, right? But it forces you to really think about things, to be more intentional.
Which seems to be the theme of the whole lecture. It's not about following a rule book. It's about recognizing that relationships are always changing. And to do it right, you need self-awareness, honesty, and good communication.
Yeah, it's like you're in charge of your own love life, You get to decide what works for you.
Right. You don't have to follow some preset path.
Yep.
And speaking of paths, the lecture brought up another interesting point about the whole friendship to romance thing. The pace of it all.
Oh, yeah, how fast or slow it happens. There's this idea that taking things slow is always the best way to go.
That makes sense. Right. You want to build a solid foundation.
Yeah, you don't want to rush into something and regret it. And the lecture agrees that slow burn approach can be great. It gives everyone time to figure things out, but then it throws in this curveball saying that taking things too slowly can actually be just as bad as moving too fast.
Really? I'm surprised to hear that. What's the problem with going slow? I mean, especially when you're risking a friendship.
Well, it's like this. Sometimes all that ambiguity, all that waiting around, it can create more anxiety than connection.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like you're in this weird in-between space, not really friends, not really dating.
Yeah, you're in limbo, and that can be exhausting for both people.
It takes all the fun out of it. You're too busy overthinking everything to just enjoy getting to know each other romantically.
Totally. You're second-guessing everything, wondering if you're reading the signs right, and that hesitation, that fear of messing things up, it can stop the whole thing from moving forward.
You get stuck.
The lecture made this analogy. It's like simmering a pot of water on the stove for too long.
Okay.
You think you're being all patient and careful, but eventually all the water boils off, and you're left with nothing.
A bird pot.
Exactly. So sometimes being bolder, taking that leap and putting your feelings out there, that can be the best way to go.
It clears the air.
Yeah. You're being direct, you're owning your feelings, and the other person can respect that even if they don't feel the same way.
It's definitely a more confident approach. But what about when one person's ready to go all in and the other one needs to take things slower?
That's where communication is so important. The lecture talks about pacing and how crucial it is to talk about it openly. You have to find a compromise, something that works for both of you.
So you're not forcing anyone or holding yourself back.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can both be honest and comfortable.
And sometimes that might mean realizing you're not on the same page.
And it's okay. You might decide to step back from the romantic stuff to protect the friendship.
Which brings us back to the importance of respecting that friendship, no matter what happens.
Always. At the end of the day, you have to treat each other with kindness and honesty, whether you end up as a couple or stay friends.
We've learned so much in this deep dive, from brain chemistry to flirting to setting expectations. It's definitely not a simple process, this whole friendship to romance thing.
Definitely not. It's a journey, and it takes work. But the lecture gives us some really great things to think about so we can navigate it all in a more authentic way.
One thing that really hit home for me was that question. What if the scariest thing isn't ruining the friendship, but missing out on something amazing because you're too afraid?
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's a reminder that sometimes you have to take a chance, even if it feels risky.
Because what if that friendship is the start of something truly special? And what if you let fear stop you from finding out?
This is a conversation that could go on forever, right? Until next time, keep those sparks of friendship alive. And remember, sometimes they turn into something even more beautiful.